So we've heard mention of it a few times already, but can you just talk through what is gene therapy? So for anyone listening that isn't quite sure what that actually is, what is it, and what is the type of gene therapy that Prevail are currently focused on?
Yeah. So this is a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer because gene therapy is many things, and this is in part why there's a lot of confusion outside of sort of the scientific fields itself. So sort of at the highest level, gene therapy is a therapy that targets one's genes. By genes, I mean someone's DNA or RNA. And this is quite a new thing, quite a novel approach. Previously, we didn't have therapies that targeted people's DNA or RNA. The therapies targeted people's cells or proteins. So here we're targeting the DNA and RNA. And what's great about it is you're getting to the root cause of genetic disorders itself. So by changing the DNA and RNA, you could have a higher chance at curing the disease. So that's what makes gene therapy so promising for diseases like Gaucher disease, because it's a genetic disorder. The example I like to give is there are a couple versions of gene therapy, but one version, for example, is pretend you have a sentence and the sentence has some errors in spelling. One type of gene therapy uses your back key to erase the word and to rewrite it. That's one type of gene therapy. That's not the gene therapy that Prevail is doing, but that's one type of gene therapy. Another type of gene therapy, and this is the one that Prevail is doing, is instead of erasing the word with your word processor, it's writing the correct word on a Post-it and putting the Post-it in the sentence. So the new word is there.
Thank you. That's really clear. I really appreciate you explaining that. I think it's one of those things we hear a lot, don't we? But, really diving down to what it actually means, that's really helpful. Thank you. Dr. Weinrab, if I can come to you, please. Obviously, it's really important now to really integrate healthcare professionals with the work and the emerging work that's coming from Jeff and his team. So would you say there is a gap in educating healthcare professionals on gene therapies? And, can we discuss the options of how that can be developed and improved?
Well, I think there definitely is a gap. The question is it a gap which is partly fueled by a general persisting somewhat lack of experience and lack of knowledge of exactly what can be accomplished, both short-term and also increasingly important long-term in terms of gene therapy. So the gap there is the gap of the lack of long-term experience. We have, of course, a number of disease models, which maybe Jeff will talk about, where we have longer experience, but each disease is different. And I don't know how much we can extrapolate from one experience, for example, whether it be with thalassemia or hemophilia or immune deficiency diseases, how much one can extrapolate to a disease like Gaucher disease. I think one of the issues that Jeff mentioned, which is very important, is that the gene that's used by the Prevail system doesn't incorporate itself directly into the genome. It works works through transcription to RNA and production of a normal protein, but it doesn't insert itself into the gene, which is, first of all, very important, because one of the concerns that existed in insertional gene therapy is there's a chance that it could insert in a bad part of the genome where it might somehow stimulate or set off some other system, which could perhaps lead to malignancy or something like that. But on the other hand, we still don't really know how long in terms of years, how long the insertion of this work is going to be. Is it going to be permanent? Will eventually it wear off? Will there need to be some sort of a booster therapy? I hate to use that word in the context of the whole COVID situation, but on the other hand, we know about that as an idea that sometimes you have to replenish what's happening. Again, I'm just mentioning a number of questions. By the fact that it doesn't erase the abnormal gene, that may potentially be an issue in terms of the Parkinson story, because we really don't know to what extent whether the persistent production of an abnormal mutated enzyme could lead to some of the problems, especially neurologically, that are associated with the disease. So again, that's not a reason not to do a study of it. It's just something which again, some of the basic research scientists are looking and considering. I mean, one of the things, perhaps when this new gene is inserted, there would be suppression of the GBA1 gene, and it would somehow not, it might even be turned off. And not produce any abnormal protein at all. But I think these are some of that stuff that we need to develop. The other issue with gene therapy, I think, which is Jeff didn't mention specifically, but I think patients don't understand. I'm not even sure that healthcare professionals always understand, is again, we're not introducing this new gene into every cell in the body. Specifically, we're certainly not starting off at an embryo phase where we're able to do what's called basically genome correction therapy from the get-go. Nobody is doing that so far, and it's looked on at the moment as too risky for science to actually go in that direction. So we correct certain cells. So again, we don't know for sure, is that correction going to be extended to other cells where perhaps the gene will not be inserted, for example, in some of the mesenchymal stem cells, where it may or may not be exerted, but which would have influence on bone maturation and bone abnormalities in Gaucher disease. So lots of questions. And finally, the real issue is once you insert it, especially, and this is true of Gaucher 1 patients, where there has been, and people like Cindy, for example, over the course of years, both prior to starting enzyme therapy and even during enzyme therapy, where there has been progressive end organ damage, how much of that can be reversed just by starting the new therapy? It would make sense then to think that the younger you start, the better your chances are. And I think that issue pertains to Parkinson's as well, because again, some of the problem with Parkinson's may be a long chronic dropout of dopaminergic neurons, which may not be replaceable just by inserting the gene. But one of the fears that I think healthcare professionals have is even if you're successful and you get it into the CNS after they're born, is that too late? Is it, or is what's going to happen that you'll maybe be able to reverse and get some improvement, but is it going to really be sustained? Are those infants going to achieve milestones, or are they going to reach a certain point and then start to progress and regress? We don't know that, and people look at that in the negative sense as maybe you're just taking a situation and stretching it out. I mean, that became an issue with bone marrow transplant for Krabbe disease, for example. But on the other hand, I do want to emphasize that one shouldn't be so necessarily pessimistic in that light, because on the other hand, we look at the hopelessness of GD2, the inevitability of a bad outcome, and the truth of the matter is we don't know that treatment may not be successful over a long period of time. There's actually an intriguing case report now, which just was published not long ago, where GD2 infant was treated with an oral medication, Ambroxol, which is not approved for Gaucher disease, but which is attracting a lot of interest right now in Gaucher disease, and actually has achieved normal milestones of development, unlike what you would expect in other such child. What was fascinating, though, about that case was that it didn't reverse the systemic manifestation. So they had to institute enzyme therapy, and at least as of the last writing, this infant amazingly seems to be doing well. So why not think about that as being a potential for the PREVAIL approach? Again,
clearly lots of questions and lots of unknowns, isn't there? And I think, like you say,
I just want to make one more point about that. The ethicists often say, is this ethical to take a child like that, maybe extend their life and just make them a chronic case, which is going to be harder for the parents to take care of and impose all those burdens on the family? But I would submit that, especially with neurological disease, if we can correct it, we don't know what the potential of that infant is. Don't forget that infant has a whole other genome and a whole other epigenome, and for all we know, such a person could turn out to be an amazing individual.
Well, I think we could probably do a webinar on that particular case study on its own. I think it's such a big topic. If I can just kind of come to you, Cindy, to bring you in on that as well then. So in terms of bridging that gap and really understanding those questions so that the healthcare professionals can feel empowered to pass that information down to patients, what role do you think the support groups and the patients sort of advocates can do in facilitating that? Is there a role for organizations in helping to move that information along and answer those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Gene therapy to the patient community is somewhat new. And there were some trials 25 years ago or so that a few patients were in for Gaucher for gene therapy. They were not successful. And it just kind of disappeared on people's minds, I think, over time. And so with it being so new and with having a patient population that doesn't quite understand what this is, and Jeff, you did an amazing job of explaining those different, the different types of gene therapy, and I'm going to recommend every patient listen to that. But what we do as a patient organization is we work closely with the medical experts, with the industry companies, to learn ourselves, really true and reliable information. And then we relay that information in our newsletter, on our website, at conferences, at patient meetings. And one of the best ways we've done it is through webinars. And so we've had different companies that are introducing a trial. We've had them on webinars, had questions. Patients get to ask questions to really truly understand what it is, how it works, and what's involved in the trial. And we keep those webinars up on our website so anyone can access them at any time. We also, as a patient organization, we serve on other other organizations and other committees. So right now, I personally am serving on the Institute for Gene Therapies to represent gene therapy for Gaucher and to have that patient voice when going to the government and trying to get trials approved. Another great way, just of course, is through social media. We communicate a lot to our patient community on social media. There's always a general Facebook page, but we actually have a closed Facebook group that's patients only. And I'm one of the administrators of this group, and it's not associated to a patient organization. I and another patient started this group 13 or 14 years ago when Facebook was new. And so we try to keep it patients and families only, and we share information and we ask questions. And so that's also been just a great way that we as a patient organization can learn the really reliable, true information, and then we bring it out to the patients.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cindy. And then if we just have a think forward, Jeff, to patient participation, what can participants expect when they're undergoing the AAV gene-based therapy for Gaucher type 1? What would they expect from that process?
Yeah, so the clinical trial process is similar, really similar across any type of clinical study. And I think it's the same here, even though it's a different type of therapy, it's a gene therapy, the process itself is quite similar. So, we have several sites that run the study. So first of all, just to be clear, Prevail doesn't actually run the study. We sponsor the study. We find experts in the clinical sites to enroll the patients, find the patients, enroll them, and follow up with them. So, so a patient would hear about the study through various media or through their physician, and then they would undergo a screening process. Usually it's a first pre-screening just to see if they have the potential to be eligible. The criteria we use in early studies tends to be quite restrictive. And in this case, we're looking specifically for patients that generally have not done well on enzyme replacement therapy. So we're looking at patients that need more than just the current standard of care. But they go through a screening process, which can take 2 to 4 weeks. They go through several tests to make sure they're healthy enough to be part of a clinical study. That may require 2 or 3 visits to the site. And they read a large document to make sure they're as informed as possible. It's called an informed consent. And if they're willing to participate, they sign the informed consent. And then they are enrolled in the study. And in our study, everyone gets the treatment. So many studies are what we call placebo-controlled. So you either get the treatment or you get a placebo. In this case, everyone gets the treatment. So it's not placebo-controlled. And so they would come in for an infusion. The infusion probably takes anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. It's not a long infusion. And then following that, they come back to the site periodically, more frequently shortly after the infusion, like every a few days, and then every few weeks, then every few months. And they have blood tests done, blood tests that are typically done in Gaucher disease, just to follow the usual parameters we follow in Gaucher disease, like blood counts, liver size, spleen size. And then they're followed for the key time period is about 1 year. And but we had, under regulations from the FDA, all patients are to be followed for 5 years. After 1 year, follow-up is relatively infrequent. It's more to maybe every 3 to 6 months. So that's the very standard approach to clinical studies. It's under good clinical studies guidelines. It's followed by the FDA. You know, this has to be accepted by the FDA. The study protocol has to be accepted by or it's reviewed and accepted by the IRBs. So it's certainly a commitment, but it also offers a great chance for the patient to develop a great relationship with the site, with the medical staff, with the site. You know, not necessarily pertaining to this study specifically, but in general, people who are part of clinical studies tend to have better outcomes, and it's in part because they have a lot of close follow-up with the physicians who are doing the clinical studies.
Wonderful. That's really helpful. And I guess quite encouraging for participants that it's not placebo controlled, because I think often that can be a deterrent as well, being in those type of studies. So Cindy, from a community point of view, Dr. Weinreb really demonstrated that there are so many unknowns and kind of questions that people may have, and information that's not been filled in, that you could understand there might be nervousness around this. You know, what is the general thought and kind of narrative within the community regarding the potential for gene therapy as this future for them? Oh, we've lost your sound there, Cindy.
Sorry about that.
That's
yeah,
okay.
I think generally people are very excited. I think a lot of patients will use the term cure, and we try to kind of steer away from that a little because we don't know at this point. I think the term one-term treatment is a great term. So yeah, there's a lot of excitement, and there's always fear. You know, what is this? What is this new stuff? You know, when other treatments have come available for Gaucher disease, such as an oral substrate reduction therapy, I thought everyone would hop off the infusions and hop onto, taking an oral medication, and that didn't necessarily happen. And so and I think a lot of times I see a trend in older patients who have become very settled into their routine, and they feel that what they're doing is working well, tend to want to stay on that. Then there's people like me that will try anything and be the first one to do it. And so there's excitement, there's a little bit of fear. I think more education will appease that fear. And then there's just questions about what is it going to cost, and will my insurance cover it, and how am I going to, how do you do this? So, but I think generally that people are excited.